I was asked to come for two reasons today. One, to reflect on what I said last year and to follow up on it 1 year on. So that'll be the main part of the speech. And then the second one is I will take part in a Brexit panel. So after the speech, if you can restrict your Brexit questions, I can take those in the panel so we don't muddy too many things. But I'll try and link the two themes today. So my speech last year actually centred on 4 key topics: digitisation, regulation, market change and efficiencies, and the relationship between all of those. So whilst I'm happy to think that it would be relevant to revisit some of the points I made previously, I don't want to adopt a wholly reflective position today. I want to actually continue to start looking forwards at where we might be rather than what has only just gone on. So in terms of fintech in particular, the reason I enjoy talking about the technology aspect of financial services is because it is that forward-looking agenda. And my daily work as an MEP, as I say, is focused on legislation, on regulation, and typically has been inspired in the time I've been in the Parliament as a post-crisis regulation. So we've had a complete tsunami of regulation that I've been dealing with. And for example, yesterday I finished a report for the Parliament's position on recovery and resolution of CCPs, the last piece in the jigsaw of that crisis regulation. And so hopefully we've now got all the pieces together, and that was the last piece. But of course it's not over. The Parliament's position has been achieved. I think it's good text. It now has to go to trialogue, where I sit with the Council and the Commission, and the 3-way negotiations start to happen. So maybe in another 3 or 4 months we might finally get that piece of legislation finished and actually in its state to come out and be utilised by those CCPs. But they are vital pieces of work in terms of that regulatory agenda. But as I say, they're not forward-looking. So what I like in terms of talking about the evolution that's taking place, there's a whole load of external stimuli at the moment that are actually causing evolution in our financial services. And in particular, I think we've got the regulatory agenda, which is causing a real big stimulus to change the way we're doing things. And we're actually seeing, of course, that data and transparency is being placed at the centre of the trading and post-trade world. And of course, that's MiFID II. Many of you probably hate that term right now, given the implementation date of the 3rd of January, and given the fact that it really has caused major disruption. But of course, the biggest catalyst for change at this point in time is probably Brexit. So it's political change, it's the geopolitical risks, and in terms of the status quo cannot stay, and therefore we really do have to find something new and ways in which we stay ahead. So there are efficiency savings that, of course, fintech is trying to deliver for the financial services sector, and we are actually seeing, with the amount of compliance and regulatory burden that's out there, that RegTech is now trying to find solutions for much of that too. But what do these have in relation to the outside stimulus? How are they being affected, and indeed, how are they being used to address some of the challenges that we are currently facing? So I'm going to try and cover some of these questions and hopefully have some of the answers to it. But I'm going to begin my remarks talking about something I referred to last year, which is about hype. Hype is all around us. And last year I was trying to explain the mood music in Brussels, in particular trying to demonstrate to you that hype in the marketplace around fintech was not necessarily a healthy thing, because the regulators and policymakers all start to take notice rather than leaving you alone. And indeed, in my introduction last year, I talked about blockchain and admitted that my exposure to virtual currencies and to crypto technologies was all about how evil this was, because it was all in the dark, it was all hidden, it was all those money launderers who were trying to get round the rules and systems. Of course, things have moved on massively since. Regardless of whether you're a skeptic or a modernizer in the cryptocurrency world, the hype was there and it's going to continue to build. But actually we're seeing many more uses being mainstreamed for this technology now. And in the last year, I think it's been an interesting move from those who are actually doing things in secret and actually trying to be in the opaque world to now people actually advertising what they're doing and trying to bring everybody else in the mainstream along with them. And I think it was a pretty accurate prediction that we were going to see much more activity in this space, and the hype probably was justified. But I have to say, in part, that's all started to materialize by the initial coin offerings that have happened in the last 12 months. ICOs weren't terminology that we as policymakers were familiar with 1 year ago. And now if we don't have ICO in a speech, there's something wrong. You're not actually with it, and you're actually certainly behind the times. And I think it's not just the ICOs themselves, but also the way in which large companies around the globe are now exploring the use of this technology and actually potentially as alternative payment systems. So in terms of fundraising payment systems, we're now seeing a major, major move to this being mainstreamed. And I think the stories of companies supposedly raising millions overnight, whether they're hoaxes or real, and actually the meteoric gains we've seen, there's always been an upwards trajectory to the value of these cryptocurrencies. But it means that the regulators are now taking note of the hype once again. These valuations are causing them concern. The fact that their citizens, the retail customers, are starting to actually dip their toes in the market are causing regulators concern. And indeed, in November of last year, ESMA warned investors about ICOs, stating that they could, of course, lose all their money. Now, anybody who didn't know that probably shouldn't have been investing in them. But actually, these warnings have been echoed by regulators around the globe. Whether it was the SEC in the US, Japan's FSE, or indeed IOSCO, they're all loudly voicing their concerns. So much so that South Korea and China have banned ICOs altogether. So in December, Commissioner Dombrovskis, the commissioner responsible for financial services, wrote to the European supervisory agencies across the board and actually implored them to discourage what he called the mania that surrounded ICOs. Looking back, I guess I can see last year the policymakers were in a much calmer mood. The case for positive and negatives were being made to them. They actually saw the opportunities that exists. Today, the speed that we always admire in the technology sector has truly been flaunted, and it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to actually affect the policymakers. Last year, I highlighted the need for industry to make use of the policymakers and to make the case for them as to why they were being useful. I argued that DLT will only be accepted in the public equity markets where retail investors place their savings if it's proved to be suitable for the professional investors first. And I believe this is still true. Distributed ledger technology has started small and is proving every day in different areas its value case by case in financial markets. An approach involving assisting in the settlement of assets currently outside of a CSD. So examples we're seeing in syndicated loan markets, securities lending, and even insurance contracts are actually giving confidence to various policymakers and regulators to make sure that we're actually seeing it starting small and growing, but proving the technology, proving its safety. And certainly last year I called for the Know Your Client rules, where people were saying that they had an improved permission system, that you're actually starting to see the results of that happening with many different groups actually showing that they can actually have a KYC permission system up and running and working effectively. Certainly a demonstration of how resilience to cyber threats can be improved through such a system and how you can actually store that data in multiple locations, which makes it safer and not actually less secure. And I think the demonstration of value amongst the hype is actually starting to seep through. So where people are now starting once again to say, okay, there is hype, but actually we still need to be quite measured about this. So I think we are hopefully starting to see regulators and supervisors starting to calm down again and actually allowing those developments to actually continue. So we've got, for example, a clear view now of the proposed treatment of where the Commission, the European Commission, is going to go with regards to crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. Last year they said they were going to leave it alone. This year they're saying they now need to actually do something to bring it into the formal regulatory environment. And certainly, whether or not the Commission choose to adopt an approach which treats crowdfunding platforms either like regulated trading venues, or God forbid they actually try and treat them as payment systems, then we're actually in a new world in terms of the regulatory environment. And certainly the treatment proposed and in the Commission's proposals has drawn massive criticism from the industry and highlights a key area where decision makers really still need a lot of help. So the main critical voices are focused on issues that arise from the interplay with the prospectus regulation, which has exempted in that piece of regulation crowdfunding projects, but only those that fall under €1 million. It exempts them from producing and publishing a prospectus. But that threshold of 1 million and the exemption from publishing a prospectus itself is actually unrealistic in the new world of crowdfunding, where larger amounts of money are routinely raised, and indeed prospectuses are electronic and they're certainly not being checked in the same way as a traditional prospectus would have been. So for me, this raises questions of how regulators should approach new technology providers. Do you adopt a service provider approach, where if a new entrant is offering the same service as a regulated incumbent, then they too need to adhere to the regulations concerned? Or do you actually get a little more sophisticated in your way of dealing with this and examine more the manner in which the service is being delivered to? And I think that in order to facilitate development and innovation, this latter idea needs a lot more attention and consideration. And I hope by this time next year, our supervisors and regulators will be a little more open-minded and will start to reflect the changes in way services can be delivered and see it as a positive and not just as a negative. So as I look forwards to the next year and the changes that I can envisage that will be leaving their mark, I think the furore around the implementation of MiFID II, as that dies down and people start to embed the processes and get that up and running, the potential that MiFID II can provide will be utilised. And I think those that actually embrace the influx of data and information that this regulation is going to provide will actually seriously benefit. And I think that regulators have got a part to play in facilitating things like a common consolidated tape. So where that data is made public to a broad audience, free after a delayed point in time. So it's not a case about somebody collating the data and then owning it. It's about them making it free to everybody and actually having that data democratization so that any fintech, any regtech firm, and indeed any investor, no matter how small, can use that data going forwards. Ultimately, that data is going to be very, very valuable for society. And I think it's important that we actually do come across as being open-minded to a European common consolidated tape. But if the market doesn't come forward with a solution, MiFID II in the small print allows the regulators to step in and actually form a public utility. And I'm already hearing noises coming from ESMA that actually indeed that they think they should be responsible for the data APAs and they should actually take direct supervision of them going forwards. And indeed, if they don't produce a market solution for a consolidated tape, they may well do it as a public utility themselves. So be warned, those of you in the data world, you might need to actually start moving a little more quickly to develop that public database. And I think change, if we're talking about change, I can't obviously get away without talking about Brexit this year. I read my speech from last year as I sat to think about what I was going to say, and I didn't mention it once. Perhaps last year I was in denial, but this year I guess I can't actually ignore it. And I think it's really important to actually look at Brexit as a stimulus for change. We are where we are, we now have to deliver the solutions. And indeed, I think the technology sector, where change is something you do all of the time and you push the boundaries, I think this is the most obvious sector where you already see a perceptible change, not just in people stepping up to provide solutions for databases, IT systems, things that have to actually change and be adapted. I certainly was hearing the government talking about DLT for the new customs system as being an alternative because they're going to have to potentially increase by orders of magnitude the flow that goes through that IT system. The patches that they have so far apparently have all been falling over, and therefore they have to start with a new system. So why not DLT? But actually, I think we've also seen an increased level of competition between jurisdictions within the EU in the last year post the referendum. We're now seeing member states increasing their work on their regulatory sandboxes. It's not just the FCA sandbox now. Every large jurisdiction in Europe now has its own sandbox. We're certainly seeing the digital agenda, the e-agenda of Estonia now being copied across many other member states. And certainly we're actually seeing a lot of the supervisors at the national competent authorities tasked with actually facilitating technology in their markets. How do they actually have a new capital markets union without the largest capital market in it post-2019? So how do you actually get to that stage? So they're all investing. They're facilitating, they're investing, they're competing with the UK in a way that they hadn't thought they had to until Brexit came about. So in December, for example, we saw the French allow for trading of unlisted stocks, bonds and fund shares, including those that are listed on exchanges using the blockchain digital ledgers. It actually removes the need for brokers, of course, and custodians, and many of the bank's roles. So fintechs are now actually taking over potentially some of these niche areas, but you can just see if they can take over the niche areas and demonstrate their value, it's not long before they start to cannibalize the mainstream too. The French are actively encouraging this move. They are trying to get the experiments and be ahead of the UK. Moreover, with Brexit potentially disrupting long-standing systems, businesses and whole industries, not just financial services, are examining all of their processes, taking a further look at all their supply chains, their business models that they've been operating for decades, and indeed the operational systems that they utilize. They're now looking at in great detail. They're all trying to find and preempt the vulnerabilities exposed by that Brexit decision. So we're in the middle of change. So Brexit is disruptive. But I actually think how disruptive in terms of a negative connotation that is going to depend somewhat upon the ultimate negotiations. But I think it's going to depend far more on how our businesses actually embrace technology and embrace that change. If they use this as a once-in-a-lifetime jump to actually invest in brand new technology, brand new systems, and to take that increased risk rather than just patching their old systems, then this might actually set us up for the next generation to come. And I think all those inefficiencies that are now being identified because people are being forced to look at their businesses and the way that they do things, actually identifying those as a byproduct of Brexit, but actually I think they may offer us solutions going forwards. And moreover, it's going to extend way beyond financial services. I mean, this is all our manufacturers. This is all of our services businesses. And we're actually going to see a lot of cross-fertilization of those ideas as we start to move into the Brexit implementation phase. And I genuinely think the UK has now got to be at the forefront of this change. So what makes London a global financial centre? I mean, there are theses galore written about this, and there are books galore out there. But actually, as well as the legal system, the ecosystem, and all of the obvious things that London has, in my view, it's been London's ability to change over the years that has kept it at the forefront and has actually delivered it as the global financial centre it has become. We saw it with the way that we had to change when the big banks all had to change their models. We saw it when open outcry was removed and we had electronic trading instead of our pits. So all those new electronic trading systems that have come about post-MiFID I, we've always continued to adapt and actually taken competitiveness to another level. Now I actually think it's time for us to actually change once again. I think it's important that we actually embrace the entire digitization and the new technologies. It's really important that efficiencies and opportunities that we now have to find because of Brexit are actually delivered And Brexit, I think, makes it essential that we embrace it. But data is universal. Technology is fast-moving, and the players and actors are global and mobile. Therefore, the UK needs to embrace the change, not only to implement Brexit, but to ensure it remains at the forefront of digitisation across all sectors, not least in the financial sector technologies. There are high risks involved, but this may be the catalyst required to actually ensure the city's next evolution and allow the country as a whole to benefit once again from financial services. Thank you. I have just spent the morning discussing the equivalence decisions in MiFID II for the trading obligation with the Commission at the Econ Committee. They obviously have made quite a significant number of equivalence decisions in the last few weeks before the 3rd of January decision, most of which were opaque, most of which had no process, and most of which were completely political. And so they didn't do a very good job, in my opinion. In fact, I've just, as we speak, I think there's a LinkedIn article going up that basically says equivalence doesn't work. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. The Commission admitted it doesn't work back in 2016, when Lord Hill was actually the Commissioner for Financial Services. They agreed to do a horizontal piece of work that would look at the way in which this was structured, and rather than it being piecemeal across every piece of legislation and implemented differently in each and every one of them, they would actually go and do something about it. Brexit meant they stopped doing that work because they genuinely don't know how to treat a former member and them now becoming a third country because of the importance of them to their markets. And so they're absolutely terrified of what that equivalence decision could mean. And so given it's a political decision, I don't think the UK can ever rely upon an equivalence decision for its business investment decisions. It's a 30-day notice period withdrawn by the Commission itself, not by ESMA, not by any of the people with expertise in markets, not for any reason other than the fact they choose to withdraw it. And so that is not a future for the UK's relationship with the EU going forwards. And if we don't find a solution for financial services equivalence at a much higher level, that is just a tiny bit of the bigger problem we've got. Because there are lots of highly regulated sectors that the UK obviously has exactly the same rules, exactly the same technical standards as the EU right now. And we have to find a solution for this at a much higher level, which would be at the level of a free trade agreement, where all services and goods are actually included across the piece with an arbitration system built into it, some form of regulatory forum. So equivalence for me is not going to be the way the UK is going to have to go. And if we fail to actually move away from that discussion, then we've got much bigger things to worry about. So I'm sure I can expand on the panel a little more. But it's a flawed system, it doesn't work, and it's certainly not going to work for one of the largest member states now moving out as a third country, but actually having all these links back into the EU network.
What comes to mind now is now for something completely different. Brexit, as we know, is still being negotiated. We don't know what sort of deal we're going to get. But we do have a panel today that can look beyond, I think, the deal, beyond where Brexit is going to take us. So we're going to have a look at how Brexit will look in terms of new regulations or not new regulations. How will it affect operations? But perhaps more importantly, how will international trade be attracted to the City of London? How will investors fare in a post-Brexit world? So without little information at this stage, our panel of, I think, eclectic but supreme experts are going to debate and discuss and cogitate with the audience perhaps the most interesting part of today, Brexit. Now, on to the panel. I know all this panel, love them dearly, and I totally respect their views. They are quite eclectic, as I say. But I think they're going to stimulate questions from you. So as we go along, if you've got a question, put your hand up and we'll deal with it there and then.
My name's Chris Skinner. I run a thing called the Financial Services Club, as well as blogging every single day at thefinancer.com about technology and banking and regulation. And I guess there's been a lot of talk about Brexit, but right now that's all it is, talk. So whatever conjecture we make about the outcomes, we have no idea what the outcomes will be. And a lot of the talk is political talk, and forgive me, Kay, but politicians often reverse their positions. So whatever Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier and Theresa May say today may not be the reality of tomorrow. And equally, a political change like Brexit has to go hand in hand with other change, which is economic, social and technological change. And there's lots of other things happening, as you just referenced, Mike. In particular, the fact that technology is globalizing the markets regardless of localizing national interests. And one of the key things that's coming out of the conversations I'm having with my German, Spanish and French colleagues is that nearly all of the Europeans I talk to think that London and the UK is going to lose big time as a result of Brexit. And yet everyone I talk to in London thinks the opposite. So there's going to be an interesting frisson. And I think the key frisson that the Europeans see is that they can gain foothold to services that London currently hosts. Obviously Euro clearing. And that's always been on the cards to go back into Europe at some point anyway, so I can't say that that's going to be the biggest loss. And equally, you don't need to be in Europe to do Euro clearing, as we can see in Hong Kong and other centres, so maybe that doesn't matter so much anyway. It's really down to the critical mass of skills and density of talent that's sitting here, and where does that fragment to if it does start to mean that London loses its position. I currently can't see it. I can see some companies hedging their bets by putting more resources into Dublin, which makes sense. Luxembourg and Berlin are playing a strong card to try and be attractive to gain some of the startup companies. But when I talk to fintechs, for example, they still see that they want to be here, not just because it's London, which is an attractive city, but because they can see that the talent they want to attract is attracted to here, because it's a global hub. And I just blogged this week about the rise of Dubai in the last 15 years and Singapore in the last 30 years as global financial centres. And when I first went to Dubai, it was just a scrap of desert. And yet today, the average price on the Palm Jumeirah for a villa is $3 million, I discovered because we were looking at them. I thought, I can't afford that. Should have bought them 15 years ago. And you know, Dubai is becoming the centre of South-South trade based on a vision driven by attracting talent and retaining talent. That's what London's been doing for centuries, and I don't see that disappearing. So to all my European colleagues, I think, yeah, there may be a dent in the backside of our car, but our car's still running pretty strong.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Rebecca.
Rebecca Healy, sorry, you can't hear me, can you? Rebecca Healy, Head of Market Structure at Liquidnet. We're a trading venue and we're an MTF and also a broker. So clearly our business is going to be impacted by Brexit along with everybody else. But I think it's interesting what you're saying, Gary, because there is a very philosophical debate here about we might want Brexit from an emotional perspective, but actually when you read Article 50, I just don't see how it's possible to happen. And I think this is the challenge that we now face. Is that whilst we can say we want agreements with the Commonwealth or Asia, actually the nuts and bolts of how you extract yourself from European regulation, it's incredibly difficult. And so some of the issues around, you know, passporting, for example, right, okay, so it was going to be passporting, now it can't be passporting because there's clearly issues there. There's equivalence, and we've got news today that, you know, the French don't agree with the Irish about how equivalence is going to happen. Kay's rightly said that equivalence is a complete mess. So, you know, we are going to have to make some hard choices, I think, about what do we want for the future. And that may mean actually saying, you know what, our future doesn't lie with Europe, which again is going to be a very difficult message for an awful lot of people. So we've managed to put ourselves, and I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, what I really think we need to start doing is face up to the situation we're in a very honest manner, rather than scrabbling around in frankly quite an undignified manner internally, and we've got to make some choices now. And if we don't, firms end up being in limbo land, which is what we're finding in the conversations that we're having with people.
Can you just clarify a point. You just said we don't want to trade with Europe.
No. I think we may end up.
We do want to trade with Europe.
Yeah, but we can't have our cake and eat it.
We can still trade with Europe. It may not be as great as it is now. We may not get everything. But it gives us the opportunity to trade with the rest of the world. And the DIT are expanding their profile to actually meet this requirement.
Okay, but for us to get equivalence, it means that we have to agree to MiFID II, full stop. There could be no rollback, because otherwise you won't get equivalence. And then you need equivalence with the European jurisdiction, which equally people don't want. So this is what I mean. We can't have our cake and eat it.
We don't want or they don't want. Because at the end of the day, they still want to trade with us. And for me, all we're really interested in are the Germans, the French, maybe the Italians. But do we actually really care about the rest of Europe? Because we don't trade with it.
Unfortunately, though, that is part of the EU 27.
But the French and the Germans are going to do everything they can to keep trading with us. The rest of Europe aren't going to bother.
That's a very interesting viewpoint, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further.
Thank you, Rebecca. Kay, would you like to respond to the panel and give a view on this?
Okay, so I'm in a very unusual position. I am a Conservative member of the European Parliament, but I obviously work on financial services, and I'm the UK spokesperson for financial services, and therefore I work with my government ministers. They happen to be the same side, it's easy. I also have just been promoted in the last year to Vice Chair of the Econ Committee in Brussels. They promoted me about 2 weeks before we invoked Article 50. And they did that deliberately so that they actually felt that they wanted a messenger, somebody who could actually bridge the gap and make sure that both sides were talking the same language. And on financial services, that's not always the case. And so sometimes when we talk about access, we don't actually mean the same things as being a member of the single market, which is a very specific thing. And because our politicians here in particular mix the two, I don't think there is a clarity on many occasions as to what people are asking for. So I'm providing a translation service right now to both sides, and it's an interesting place to be. But neither side want to do any harm to each other. And I don't for a minute think that anyone has an agenda that actually is about doing us harm, and we certainly don't want to harm the 27 other member states that we sell to. But our biggest issue, to be honest, is not the goods that we buy from France or Germany or indeed Sweden or a Danish bacon or a pork from the Netherlands, whatever. It's not that. The issue we have, unusually, out of those 28 countries, of which we're the 28th in this scenario, we have got a surplus of 80% in the services sector with the rest of the EU. 80% surplus. It's not about goods. Goods is easy. Most goods these days, under WTO rules, actually trade fairly tariff-free. Most people want you to have some form of a tariff reduction. That's easy. What's not easy is services. Services do not actually feature very much in the WTO rules. They are almost silent. We tried under TISA back in 2013 to actually start to expand the rules for the WTO to include services, and it was deemed too difficult to be done at WTO, so it was dropped. They tried to do it under TTIP. We obviously haven't got very far on TTIP, which is the EU-US trade deal, and the other was the Transatlantic Partnership Network, where they were trying to do it, and again, that hasn't gone very far. So you've ended up with trade deals stumbling when they're trying to include services in the last few years. So we are going to ask, and I think it can be delivered, but it's a brand new ask, where we are going to ask for goods and services to be treated equally for the first time ever in a free trade deal globally. And so it's huge. And to think that other people are going to help us do it when the surplus is our direction, not the other way, is the problem. And so we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of understanding to make sure that people actually really do understand that we're not trying to diminish them in any way. We are just trying to make sure we can continue to serve their customers, because it's in their interests to have their architects, to have their accountants, to have their lawyers, to have people who service them now from these shores actually continue to do so, so that they don't have huge disruption. But that's our biggest problem. And it's that agenda that is so new that to deliver it in the shortest time possible for an FTA ever to have been done with the EU is my biggest concern. So timing is a problem, and the inclusion of services on an equal footing is another huge elephant in the room. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I am trying to find solutions. My colleagues are trying to find solutions. But what helps me is the political hype that comes from euro clearing. I have spent 8 years of my political life in Brussels working on CCPs and regulating CCPs and knowing and understanding them globally as a former investment banker. Most of my colleagues have left me to it because they don't understand the detail of what central clearing is. They all now are suddenly experts, both at Westminster and in Brussels and in every national parliament, on apparently what clearing is, apparently. But the idea that euro clearing is going to be repatriated, as Hollande said the day after the referendum, it was never in the Eurozone. The euro was created as a global currency. It's always been cleared in London and in New York and in Singapore. It's never been cleared in the Eurozone in any significant quantity. So it's a case of actually trying to educate the politicians too. And it's very easy to get upset by certain things, but we have to step back from it. Euro clearing isn't the issue. When you actually get down and scrape the surface of where the shocks come in monetary policy for the central banks that issue across Europe, it's the repo market. That's what they're going to take back. That's what they're actually going to control, and they don't want us to have it. And in all fairness with T2S and other systems, actually it's not ours. So, we do have to be grown up about this. And it's not about the big high-level politics and the big rhetoric. It's about the detail of how we make this work. And I genuinely think that we have to completely and utterly sort of block our ears to both sides, whether it's Michel Barnier or David Davis. I don't listen to anything either of them say. Because it's not
Can I just...
Gary.
Could I ask one question?
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, Rebecca,
Can
go
I
on.
just ask you a quick question? So in the...
So now the panelists are asking.
Sorry, in the European Parliament report on sort of how Brexit would play out, one of the comments that they made was that they anticipated, well, there was work done on analysis if they felt that the cost of capital would go up between 5 and 10 basis points. Is that our best lever to be able to explain that actually it is in our best interest to work together? Because that's going to impact Europe as well as it's going to impact the UK. It'll impact European firms that are trying to access UK markets. I mean, is that a way that we can deal with this?
The best lever and in fact the best allies we have currently are the multinational companies that are based in the EU 27, because they don't want to be cut off from a global financial market that's on their doorstep that gives them cheaper cost of capital. And they are lobbying very hard in all of those member states' capitals to make sure that their national politicians understand what it means to them. And so the Parliament ultimately isn't going to play a very big part in this in Brussels, but the national parliaments will play a very big part in putting pressure on their ministers to support pragmatic solutions. And those companies, and I keep telling them not to spend any time in my office, because I already know that it's an issue, they need to go to each and every member state's national parliamentarians to make sure they're aware of it, so the pressure is put back on. And Michel Barnier is on very thin ice at the moment, because he is talking about financial services can't be included in a future free trade deal, something he said in December and reiterated a couple of weeks ago. He has no mandate. He only has a mandate for the withdrawal at this point in time. The mandate for the future relationship with the EU 27 is being drawn up over the next few weeks and months, and we won't know what that is until at least March in its outline, because that's when the Council will meet to to actually give him a mandate. So all of it is rhetoric and hype. And as I say, you need a pair of earmuffs and ones that work well.
Chris, have you got a point on this?
I was just going to say, in the meantime, we're replacing the euro with Bitcoin. Not quite. Until the regulators get there. No, I think the key point is to what Case just said, and the fact that nothing has been agreed right now. So anything that's being debated is open speculation. I know from talking to some of my Brussels friends that Michel Barnier is going through the rule books and trying to find legal wordings that can allow him to agree something, but there is no precedent in history for what's going on. No member state has ever left the European Union. So there is nothing today written or agreed anywhere about what happens in the future. We will create it. And I think that's the key thing, that right now, and again, as Case illustrated, many of the other European nations regret the Brexit decision, but recognise that we still have to work together as we always have. Yeah. I run a group in the Nordic region that right now believes that they see London as the centre of the financial universe, and they don't see that changing in the next 10 years.
Okay.
Do you think
Mike, have you got a point?
No, but the 10-year point's interesting, I think. It's good. And the other thing that I kind of believe is that no one really saw this coming, so no one has anticipated it, and therefore no one is prepared to step in. I think that's true Europe globally as well. But in 10 years' time, then if people have planned and implemented things, then the world can really change. So my personal belief is this will take quite some time, but it is an opportunity for very substantive change. But
Have we got a question from the floor?
Yeah, I mean, just to build up that 10 years or whatever, because there's going to be a lot of detail in the next 1-2 years. And something that Chris said, the success of the City of London is based on talented people wanting to come here, wanting to have careers. And I just think whatever the intention of Brexit, send out a message to say, we're an island, we don't want you to come here. There's an awful lot of rhetoric around that, and that will take a long time to feed through, but it will immediately be more difficult for people from the EU to come here, presumably, because now we have complete free movement, so whatever you have on top of that is going to make it harder. I don't think that will immediately stop people, but 5-10 years down the line, do you say, oh, well, actually, bigger country, they're more welcoming to us, we're going to go there. And I just think that if it's the people that really has given us the advantage, just in the long term, isn't that, are we going to drive those people away or make it harder for them to come here?
it's a really interesting question. I'll answer this as a Kiwi on the panel. It's a really good point. I think the people piece is critical. But that's actually within, looking at this from a UK perspective, that's totally within our control to make that attractive. I agree with Chris that London is, a fantastic city for markets and things for a number of reasons. So it is certainly over the next decade, it's still got the attributes that will attract people to it. The education and the skilling opportunity and challenges that exist are there. That is one of the things that where you don't want to introduce friction. You want to keep that going. But that's within our control. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I was just thinking there's an interesting point in this, which is obviously Brexit was voting against the free movement of people, but wants to keep the free movement of goods, services and capital. You can't have your cake and eat it, but what you can have is your fudge. And I think that's what we're going to have, a lot of fudging going on over the next 5 years to say, well, yes, you have left Europe, but you haven't really. We're going to sticking plaster over these bits and enable people to come to London if they want to come because we want London to stay ahead. I think there's going to be an awful lot of fudging going on.
But Europe has always fudged. I mean, it's why it works. It's because it can fudge, and it does it very, very well. I mean, the UK has been outside of the biggest political projects of the last few decades. And yet it says everybody has to, there's a single currency of the Union. No, the UK never had to join it. So actually they already fudged it back at the beginning of the EMU. Schengen was supposed to be open borders for everybody. UK and Ireland, because they had an open border with the UK. No, they don't have to do it. We've always fudged in Brussels. It's what they do. And so when anybody thinks that, when we come to a deadline, that fudge isn't going to be made is kidding themselves. It's why Europe works, because they actually do find ways to make it happen.
And in fact, a great example of that is the equivalence regime and the idea, because we were debating it the other night, that London's a great place for implementing directives. And we would probably look at Europe and say, do you have equivalence in some of the nations? Because Spain and other countries implemented all these directives really late. So again, it's an example of fudging.
Yeah, and how many of them haven't yet even transposed MiFID II
Exactly.
into their statute book? And I quoted this morning 17, which is the numbers I was given by ESMA last week. It's gone down to 10, apparently. So there have been a further 7 of them who transposed in the last week or so. But I mean, even so, half of the member states, even though they'd had 1 extra year, had not transposed it onto their statute book. So I mean, there is a lot of give and take here, and I think our problem is we see things in black and white, and it's either this or it's that, whereas actually most of my colleagues are much more fluid in what they think they're getting, and less stressed about it. We're the ones that are getting stressed about this. Most of my colleagues feel that Brexit is number 4 or 5 on their shopping list of priorities. It's not up there. We don't talk about this every day. The only committee that actually gives us any airtime is the Econ committee, because actually most of us are internationalists on that committee who really feel quite strongly about sort of the whole continuity of capital markets and capital flow. But most of the other committees don't give it a thought. It's just something
Just
that
one quick
will
question on that,
happen.
and I know we're going to the floor, but I saw a comment the other day that the Bulgarian presidency has 5 key priorities, and not one of them was Brexit.
So do you think we'll end up going to more of a transition period where we can actually create that fluid state where we negotiate our way around it? And how will that sit with some of the Brexiteers that are pushing for a lot more of a clear decision?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
And my real problem is that there is a population, and at least half of it expects something to be delivered that is the most complex thing to try and deliver that has ever been imagined in terms of public services and every other service that you can vaguely imagine. And because on paper it sounds a very simple decision, the practice is incredibly complicated. Everything we do, talking to a judge a week or so ago, our judges, our court circuits, if you have to remove EU precedent from our legal system and actually only refer to UK case law, then actually they did an analysis over a 6-month period, the end of last year, and over 80% of those cases were from European precedents. And therefore, you're now starting, each and every sector is going to have to rethink the way in which they do stuff. And that in itself is a very complex set of things to do. But the problem we've got is that as we're busy trying to unpick ourselves, everybody else are focused on the future. And have actually got all the airtime to look forwards and look outwards. And so we've got to be very careful that we seize the opportunity of change and put those risky, maybe more technologically advanced systems in place once and for all, so that we're spending good time looking inwards, sort of preparing for that next surge, rather than actually just trying to make the best of things. Because otherwise we're going to be left behind, because they genuinely are moving massively forwards. The quickest piece of negotiations I've ever seen were from September last year to just before Christmas, where PESCO, the new security and defence cooperation for the EU, was put in place. It was launched as a concept in September. 25 member states had signed up to it by December. That is the quickest anything has ever happened. And that's actually a common defence and security policy in the absence of the UK going forwards. So Schengen took a damn sight longer than that to do. So they are moving forwards. They have this new energy. They're actually looking outwards, and they're actually looking at what they need to do to stay relevant after the UK goes. So they've used Brexit as a massive catalyst for their activity. And we've got to be careful we don't get subsumed by the detail and don't get left behind in that particular analysis.
Question from the floor.
Thanks. So I just want to bring it back to operations. And so do we believe that for London, for the UK, Brexit will involve things like rewriting whole swathes of client legal agreements, or at least supplementary or additional clauses, other things that need to be included and considered other than the use of resources. Perhaps the panel can expand on some of those things that actually fundamentally will also impact operations.
It's GDPR, and
That's not implemented yet.
But it is going to be down to things like repapering the agreements, how data can be shared between Europe and the UK. It is, unfortunately, it is those boring details that mean that firms are, as Kay said, we're going to have to get ahead of this and just accept that we need to start building operations in a European nation, and it might be money that doesn't need to be spent in the end, but in actual fact to prepare ourselves, that's I think what firms are going to have to start looking at, because yes, we can look to the longer term and the future technology and all the rest of it, but in order, because it is a services industry that we have, we do need to get those legal agreements signed up and arranged, and the data in particular and how we share it is very critical.
But repapering contracts is a massive, massive ordeal. And the one huge disappointment for me was that in Article 50, when we talked about citizens' rights, it was only ever kept to the right to move, the freedom of movement. It was the right to reside, but it didn't go for your right to have continuity of your financial contract. So your insurance contract was provided by your French firm, or your insurance contract was provided by your German firm, or indeed the other way around, where the British firms are actually supplying all of those Brits who live in Spain. Those contracts are just as much a citizen's right to have those contracts continue as any other citizen's right. And so why did Article 50 restrict itself to that one very narrow issue of citizens' rights? It means we've now got to catch up in the next phase and make sure that they're actually all talked about. But I can tell you that the pension providers, the insurance providers across mainland Europe, who've got major customers here, are actually a little upset about this too. And in terms of life assurance market, there is no way do they want to reissue those contracts through a UK subsidiary and actually ending up having to take on the risk themselves of somebody who now maybe could be 10, 15, 20 years older than when they originally took the contract out with them. So there are huge issues here. I think the derivatives world, where the millions of contracts need to be redone, will find a way. I genuinely am not concerned about the wholesale markets. We will find a way. There's a massive paper done by ISDA very recently.
I think that's a key point that Kate's making, though, that we'll find a way, because I've seen so many European directives that are being transposed and implemented. And, for example, with MiFID I, the idea that based on best execution, we'd have to repaper all our contracts across all of our contracts with customers across all of the London markets. It went away because it would have cost billions. The whole idea of trade reporting and the initial proposals around trade reporting standards would have cost billions to implement. So it gets scaled back because of the practicalities to find a way to do it that won't cost billions. So if for some reason during Brexit something comes up that says, oh, by the way, you're going to have to spend 10 billion euros just wasted in investment because of this area here, then we'll change it. So we don't have to do 10 billion wasted euros in that one paragraph.
I agree with that. Just one last thing that comes to mind, that if we're setting up contingency plans and let's say those contingency locations may be Berlin, Frankfurt, Dublin, what opportunity do you believe London has to then, in the future, as we're looking further down the line, to bring that business back to London? Because I see an issue in that, on the basis that we don't know what the future holds, so many firms are setting up contingencies, and rightly so. But to then, is there an honest likelihood that those contingencies will then come back to London, and London will then be reinforced as it's been in the past?
It might, although what I think is happening more likely is that UK government's made it quite clear that they want China, India, and new markets and emerging markets to focus on London. So rather than trying to bring back the little bits that are lost as contingency to Dublin or to Berlin, I think they're looking much further afield.
Sure.
Okay. Mike, you've been a bit quiet over there. Have you got a response on any of this?
No, I actually generally agree with Chris. I think I do see firms already starting to try and introduce some certainty by taking actions. I don't think they can operate in what is really a very uncertain place at the moment. So they are starting to take some actions, and some of that is in an operational context, in a systems context, which is probably more my world. They're rolling on from MiFID II into what they think they need to do for Brexit, because it otherwise the timescales will be impossible to deal with. Whether you can, and the balance there is to do something that's sensible, that doesn't drive you down a somewhere you don't want to get to, and how you balance that. So some really hard decisions to make in terms of scope and scale. Whether ultimately you can bring those back. It is contingency planning, essentially.
And you're absolutely right. I think everybody was so snowed under with MiFID II that they had to sort of hold fire until we got past MiFID II, and now sort of the Brexit contingency planning is kick-starting.
Off,
But it is about having that practicality of trying to make sure that you do sufficient, but you still keep your eye on the prize, which is the longer-term wider markets overall.
Right, yeah.
But anything that is retail focused. So if you're selling to retail customers in the EU27, you will need to be in the EU27. So passporting as we know it, which is in various pieces of legislation, it's not a universal concept, much like equivalence. It's piecemeal. It is not a nice, tidy thing across different financial services dossiers. Passporting will not be open to us. It is only open to full members of the single market. And so we are not going to be that, no matter what the relationship is going forwards. So
Fudge it.
no, you can't fudge this one, because consumer protection is at the heart of it, and it's a national focus for each of those EU27. They will only give up their consumer protection role to another EU member state because they have to under the treaty. They will not do that beyond the EU family. So, and data is the other big one. I mean, Interpol is not allowed to give its data, the core raw data, access the database to anybody who's not an EU member state. It's in the treaty. So you have to find a way that you can get someone else to look at the data for you in order that you have the information you require. So it will not be first order looking into the database. It will be a request taken from the UK as an outside member state that we need this data, and I'm sure they will have a data sharing agreement, but actually direct access to those databases to search them at your own will, extensively, will not be allowed to a non-EU member state.
Right.
So and there are some big changes we have to look at, the way that things do.
And the relationship between UK and Europe, I mean, if you look at passports, it's 5,000 firms and 336,000 passports for the UK. 8,000 firms in Europe for just 25,000 passports. So we have the issue in the UK in trying to figure out how we're going to get over that hurdle. And it comes down to investor protection. That is going to be the biggest focus. And as much as we might want to look to the future for wholesale markets, that's probably going to be okay. But any retail activity is really going to struggle.
Right. With the theme of 2025, as we move towards the close of the session, can I ask the panel to give me a picture of what the UK financial services will look like in 2025? What assets do we have today will still be here, and will there be any that's gone? If so, which? Mike.
2025. So optimistically, I think London, the UK, retains its people, its intellectual capability. I think it has embraced what technology does enable. It has probably pivoted away from Europe to a fairly substantive degree, optimistically into the Chinas, the Indias, etc. of this world.
Okay. Chris?
Well, for those who know me, I spend all my time looking towards the future. And what's interesting for me right now is that there's a three-stream world. There's Europe and America, which I call the legacy economies of the world, because our infrastructure is old. It was implemented in the last century, and we've avoided, in many cases, changing it or bringing it up to speed with today's technologies. And equally, what we do implement takes an awful lot of time. So, the single euro payments area is still ongoing after 15 years. T2S took over a decade to implement. In the meantime, I go to somewhere like Hangzhou, China, where Ant Financial and Alibaba are head officed. And when interviewing the guys at Ant Financial, I was just blown away because they're on their 5th generation systems architecture for a company that's 14 years old. They throw away their systems every 3 or 4 years. They're building their systems right now for 1 million transactions per second for 2 billion people, which is quite phenomenal. And every single transaction will have automated artificial intelligence for fraud and risk analytics. Their vision is unbounded. They're going global. And it struck me, and this brings the point home to me, that when we had a meeting in Helsinki last year with IPASI, which is the Ant Financial partner in Finland, to enable Chinese tourists to come and see Father Christmas, it was a great story. They came to an agreement in June 2016 and were live by October 2016. So real fast cycle change. They just get things done. And that meant that people from Beijing and Shanghai could come to Lapland and use the same mobile payments app as they use at home. The next day I had a meeting in Stockholm where we were debating between Swish, Shirtu, Mobile Pay, and Vips, which are the mobile wallets of the Nordic region, about interoperability. And I'm sitting there thinking, so our Chinese tourists can travel 6,000 kilometers and use the same app. And I can't go from Malmö to Copenhagen, which is 60 kilometers, and use the same app. And I said to IPASI, why don't you put in a Nordic version of Ant Financial? And they said, well, that's what we're developing, which means it's going to go global. And last year, $15.5 trillion was paid in China through mobile apps. The year before, $5.5 trillion. In America, $140 billion is paid in mobile apps, $6 trillion on cards. That's the legacy economy. China's the growth visionary economy. And then you have the innovation economies of the world, which in particular are coming out of sub-Saharan Africa through mobile financial inclusion, doing microtransactions for micro-savings, micro-investments and micro-payments, and reinventing the whole and imagining the whole new generation of financial services. So by 2025, I think we're going to find the legacy economies of Europe and America struggling to implement the innovations and visions of China, Asia and Africa.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
Okay, so I'm going to put my optimistic head on as well, and I really hope that we do see the level of innovation that you're talking about in terms of technology, and we do have the intellectual capacity to be able to achieve that, and now I believe that we actually have the UK government really behind the whole project in terms of getting that innovation in technology more mainstream. The other factor is, I actually left the city in 2007, 2008. I was very disillusioned with the city, and I ended up in the Middle East. And what was quite remarkable was the weight that they still held in terms of the rule of law and the ability to be able to get business done and the sort of the structure, the corporate governance behind it. So that almost gives us, if we can manage to create that balancing act between the two, that does leave the UK in a very good position. But what we need to be able to do is get to the point where we can have a skinny relationship with Europe, help Europe out with the sort of the capital, the cost of capital and keeping that low, but still manage to extract ourselves so that we can move forward in a much more innovative and dynamic way. And I'm afraid that is over to you.
Okay, Kay.
So I'm a firm believer that the UK will remain open for business, so open access, where we don't understand why people can't come and trade in our markets, provided they're obeying the rules. They should be allowed here no matter where they come from, wherever their company is based. Most of my colleagues in the EU do not think that way. Most of them feel you have to be based somewhere in Europe in order to have access. So I think there's a complete disconnect. So I think we'll stay open access. And I think we have to take it to a completely new level with new technologies. So I'm actually desperate to see in the post-trade space that technology changes that allow us to leapfrog, where location policy becomes redundant, because you have the ledgers that actually allow you to go global very, very quickly. Doesn't matter where your client is around the world, you will be able to deal with it through your platform. So I also want to see the payment systems transformed. I don't just want China doing it, I want us doing it. I find it incredibly frustrating that we do not have the same ability to move forwards at the pace that others are moving at. And I don't think Europe holds us back, I think the UK holds us back. I think there are all sorts of things. The Bank of England isn't exactly known for its proactive response to things. It is very definitely conservative with a little c. I want them to employ and second huge numbers of technical experts into the bank to give them a vision that they may not have themselves. And I think they've got to be at the forefront of some of this new payment systems, the new way, the new world, rather than saying, no, we're not regulating, you can't be part of our payment system. They've got to embrace it. They've got to get it out there on the front foot. But I also am so happy to see the government of the day now supporting technology firms. It's a complete mindset change where that support is going in, not just through tax breaks, but actually proper support. And for me, the ultimate goal will be, can the UK stop being the red tape capital of the world? We do most of that red tape to ourselves, and we use the EU as an excuse. When you actually look down at it, the UK is the best country in the world to wrap ourselves up in bureaucracy. We have got to cut through it all. We've got to decide to take some risks, and we've genuinely got to stop Westminster taking over the role that was perceived to have been taken by EU politicians.
Oh, brilliant answer. Last question to finish the session. We start in Brexit sometime next year with a regulatory environment which will be broadly aligned with the EU.
Identical.
Yeah. Now in 2025, given that we will be free and dealing internationally, it would be logical to expect that that regulation might start to not be identical. It might be more geared towards the global international markets, to cut, as you say, the red tape, to do things slightly differently to the way the EU is operating. How feasible is that? I think, Kay, I think you should answer that.
I'm not sure that what I see at the moment amongst bureaucrats, that there's much of an appetite to cut anything. I think we may end up gold-plating further. And the case in point being that when people tell me MiFID II wouldn't look like it does now if it wasn't, if we weren't part of the EU, go and read the Fair and Effective Markets Review that was done between Treasury, the Bank of England and the FCA. It went a lot further in some areas than MiFID II does. And that was a British-only look at the markets and what should happen. So, a lot of the things the FCA was arguing for in technical working groups at EU level, they failed to get in because their German colleagues said no. They would have gone a lot further. So you've got to be very careful when you think you're going to actually have this huge cut through of red tape, because culturally, I'm not sure we're ready to do that yet. But I think we can take an alternative step. I think we can actually be the best regulated without actually having a bonfire of regulation. And if the EU moves in step with us, why would we want to go against them when actually it is still going to be 420 million people where we have to sell our goods and services? In the same way, why wouldn't you want to work at global fora, making sure that the global financial centres move in sync rather than move against one another? It's much better for us to lead that global effort and actually put massive energy into those global fora to make sure we bring the US and keep the EU in line and that the output is fairly similar. And I'm very optimistic that that's where our regulators, that's where our supervisors and our politicians will focus, is how do we lead those global fora? How do we maybe even make something like the FSB a little more useful in terms of being able to deliver things rather than just a talking shop? And I think we will go ahead, but on a global level rather than regional level going forwards. I'm optimistic, but I don't think you should wait for the red tape to be cut. It may get a little pink, but it's not going to go away.
Well, I'm just going to ask you for each a one-liner to close the session. Anything you would like to say to the audience about City of London, post-Brexit 2025. Is there anything you would like to leave with a message to the audience? Mike.
I think the key message is essentially partly what Kay said before. So it is up to the City of London or the UK more generally to drive forward. It should drive forward to lead, to innovate. There is an opportunity here, and really the success or failure will be determined how that's grasped.
Okay. Chris?
It's not one line, it's building on the last question actually, and then the one line. Okay. In that what's intriguing right now is that London and the UK will obviously do what's in the interest of London and the UK. And I was going to say earlier on that it seems a shame that we won't be part of Europe because we won't get a vote on the financial regulations that are MiFID 3 and PSD 3 and all the other things coming downstream. But at the same time, if we don't like them, then we can just break apart from them. And one of the big things that opened my eyes was listening to Jack Ma of Alibaba talking about the company and how he sees their ecosystem. And he was asked a question about how he manages the company. He said management is for companies and other companies than ours, because we are not a company, we are an ecosystem platform of many companies that are buying and selling and trading through our platform. So my role is to govern the platform, not to manage the platform. We are governors. And that means that they are regulators of their platform. And so I think downstream, towards the end of the next decade, Google, Apple, Facebook, Baidu, Tencent, Ant Financial, Alibaba will be the regulators of trade, trying to work in the interests of the governments that they work with, but running global platforms that don't recognise national boundaries.
Excellent.
And that actually is one of the positive things that I think has come out of MiFID 2. Believe it or not, there is something positive. Just in terms of, so if you take investor protection, for example, then that actually, it started off from the UK and the FCA, but it is now global. We heard today that Australia is now doing something, FINRA is looking at it. So if we can get it so that the firms are embracing the change and can demonstrate to the regulators that they do have end investors and they are going to look after the general population, then we've got that potential to start getting over being regulated by, and we self-regulate, which means that we're actually able to move forward in a way that we haven't been able to thus far.
Okay, lovely. Kay, last word with you.
Well, Brexit is going to be hugely disruptive, but it's also the biggest catalyst that we have for change that this country has probably seen in a generation. And therefore we have to embrace that change. So all incumbents have got to actually look at their systems, look at what they do, how they do it, and how they can leapfrog to the next level. And I think it's going to be really important that we actually have that vision rather than still wanting to do things as we do now. I think vision is going to be all about how we actually go forwards.
And a great positive note to finish on. And please, this has been a fantastic panel, fantastic debate. I knew it would be with the quality of people that we've got there. Please greet them.